A racist cop pulled over a black police captain. But when the captain confronted him about his bias, Officer Tom Reynolds eased his patrol car down Maple Street, the setting sun casting long shadows across Brooksville's quiet suburbs. The warm glow of streetlights began to flicker on, illuminating the neat rows of houses with their perfectly manicured lawns. It was a scene of tranquility that belied the undercurrents of tension that ran through the town. At 43, Reynolds was a veteran of the Brooksville Police Department. 15 years on the force had etched lines around his eyes and sprinkled gray at his temples. His blue uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a high shine, a reflection of his unwavering commitment to order and discipline. As he approached the intersection of Maple and Oak, a black SUV caught his attention. The vehicle was moving just a touch faster than the posted limit. Without hesitation, Reynolds flipped on his lights and siren, a familiar surge of adrenaline coursing through him. The SUV pulled over smoothly, coming to a stop beneath the spreading branches of an old oak tree. Reynolds approached, flashlight in hand, and tapped on the tinted window. As it rolled down, he was met with the calm gaze of a well-dressed black man in his early 50s. License and registration, Reynolds demanded, his tone brusque and authoritative. The driver compiled without a word, handing over his documents with a slight smile that puzzled Reynolds. He retreated to his cruiser, running the information through the system. His heart skipped a beat as he read the name, Captain Jonathan Harris, the newly appointed head of the Brooksville Police Department. Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard about Captain Harris, but had never met him in person. The new captain's appointment had been a source of controversy in the department, with some officers grumbling about diversity hires and political correctness. Taking a deep breath, Reynolds returned to the SUV. "Captain Harris," he said, his voice now tinged with a forced respect, "I apologize for the inconvenience. I didn't realize it was you." Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. "No problem, Officer Reynolds. We all make mistakes." He paused, then added, "May I have a word with you?" Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. As they stood under the dim streetlight, the hum of cicadas filling the air, Harris spoke with a calm yet firm tone. "Officer Reynolds, I've heard about your work in this department. You have a reputation for being strict and thorough, which is commendable." Harris's dark eyes seemed to pierce through Reynolds. "However, I've also heard rumors about certain biases that may influence your judgment. I want to address this head-on." Reynolds felt a knot form in his stomach. He remained silent, listening intently as Harris continued. "I believe in leading by example and fostering an environment of respect and equality," Harris said. "Our duty is to serve and protect all members of our community, regardless of their background. Prejudice has no place in our line of work." Reynolds struggled to maintain his composure. "Sir, I assure you, I treat everyone fairly," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Harris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you believe that, Officer Reynolds. But sometimes our actions speak louder than our intentions. I'd like you to really think about how you approach your job, who you stop, and why. We're here to make Brooksville safer for everyone, not just some." With that, Harris bid Reynolds good night and drove away, leaving the officer standing alone under the streetlight, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. As Reynolds climbed back into his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Captain Harris's words had cracked open a door in his mind, letting in a sliver of light that illuminated the shadows of his long-held beliefs. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. As he drove home in the early hours of the morning, the streets of Brooksville silent and empty, Reynolds found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about being a good cop. That night, Reynolds tossed and turned in bed, Harris's words echoing in his mind. As dawn broke, streaming through the gaps in his bedroom curtains, he found himself staring at an old photograph on his nightstand. It showed a young Tom Reynolds, barely 10 years old, standing proudly next to his father in front of their modest home in the working-class neighborhood of East Brooksville. Reynolds's mind drifted back to his childhood, to the conversations around the dinner table where his father, a factory worker, would complain about immigrants stealing jobs and minorities ruining the neighborhood. Those words had seeped into young Tom's consciousness, shaping his worldview in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He remembered the day his father lost his job when the factory closed down. The bitterness and anger that followed had only reinforced the prejudices in their household. Tom had carried these biases with him into adulthood, into his career in law enforcement, often without even realizing it. As he got ready for his shift, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Captain Harris's words had cracked open a door in his mind, letting in a sliver of light that illuminated the shadows of his long-held beliefs. The precinct was abuzz with activity when Reynolds arrived. He nodded to his partner, Mike Donnelly, a burly man with a quick temper and an even quicker wit. "Hey, Tom," Mike called out. "Heard you had a run-in with the new captain last night. What's he like?" Reynolds hesitated, unsure how to describe the encounter. "He's different," he said finally. "Seems to have some big ideas about how things should be run around here." Mike snorted. "Great. Another reformer who thinks he knows better than the guys on the street. Just what we need." As they headed out on patrol, Reynolds found himself hyper-aware of every interaction. He noticed the way Mike tensed up when they drove through predominantly minority neighborhoods, the subtle change in his tone when addressing people of color, and for the first time, Reynolds realized he was doing the same things. It was a slow day, filled with routine traffic stops and minor disputes. But with each interaction, Reynolds felt a growing discomfort. He began to question his instincts, wondering if his judgments were truly based on behavior or if something else was influencing his decisions. As their shift was ending, a call came in about a suspected drug deal in progress near the old factory district. Reynolds and Mike responded, arriving on the scene to find two young men, one white and one black, standing near a parked car. Mike immediately focused on the black man, his hand instinctively moving towards his weapon. "You, hands where I can see them," he barked. Reynolds found himself hesitating. He looked at the white man, who seemed just as nervous and fidgety as his companion. "Both of you, hands up," he said, his voice steady. A quick search revealed no drugs, just two friends who had been changing a flat tire. As they apologized and sent the young men on their way, Mike turned to Reynolds with a puzzled expression. "What was that about?" he asked. "Since when do you go soft on these situations?" Reynolds shook his head. "I'm not going soft, Mike. I'm trying to be fair. Double quotes. As they drove back to the station in silence, Reynolds couldn't help but wonder how many times he had jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than the color of someone's skin. The realization left him feeling unsettled and ashamed. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Reynolds made a decision. He would talk to Captain Harris again. He needed to understand more about what the captain had meant, about how to be a better officer, a better person. Little did he know, this decision would set him on a path that would not only change his life, but the entire fabric of Brooksville itself. The next morning, Reynolds arrived at the station earlier than usual. He made his way to Captain Harris's office, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and determination. He knocked on the door, half hoping the captain wouldn't be in yet. "Come in," came the response from inside. Reynolds entered to find Captain Harris already at his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. The captain looked up, surprise briefly flitting across his face before he schooled his expression into one of polite inquiry. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "what can I do for you this morning?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "Captain, I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about biases and fairness. I think you might be right, and I want to do better." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Reynolds intently. After a moment, he nodded. "I appreciate you coming to me, Officer Reynolds. It takes courage to admit we might need to change. Tell me what made you come to this realization." For the next hour, Reynolds opened up to Harris about his upbringing, his father's influence, and the incident from the previous day. Harris listened attentively, occasionally asking probing questions that made Reynolds dig deeper into his thoughts and motivations. As their conversation drew to a close, Harris stood up and walked around his desk. "Reynolds, I'm glad you came to me. Recognizing our biases is the first step towards overcoming them. I have a proposal for you." He outlined a new community outreach program he was planning to implement, aimed at building better relationships between the police and Brooksville's diverse communities. "I'd like you to be part of this initiative," Harris said. "It won't be easy, and you'll likely face resistance from some of your colleagues, but I believe you have the potential to make a real difference." Reynolds left the office with a mix of emotions, uncertainty about the path ahead, but also a growing sense of purpose. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, Reynolds found himself hyper-aware of his interactions with the public. He began to notice patterns in his behavior that he had never questioned before. The way he tensed up when approaching a car with a driver of color. The subtle differences in his tone when addressing people from different backgrounds. One afternoon, he responded to a noise complaint in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. As he approached the address, he caught himself assuming it would be a rowdy party, maybe with illegal activities. Instead, he found a Quincera celebration, a coming-of-age party for a 15-year-old girl. The family, initially wary of his presence, invited him in for a piece of cake when they realized he wasn't there to shut down their celebration. Reynolds found himself staying, chatting with the guests, and even attempting a few dance steps. As he drove back to the station, Reynolds felt a mix of emotions, shame at his initial assumptions, but also a warmth from the unexpected connection he'd made with the community he was meant to serve. The changes in Reynolds didn't go unnoticed at the station. Some officers, like his longtime partner, Mike Donnelly, were skeptical. "What's gotten into you, Tom?" Mike asked one day over coffee. "You going soft on us?" Reynolds struggled to explain his evolving perspective. "It's not about going soft, Mike. It's about being fair, about doing our job right." Other officers, particularly younger recruits and officers of color, seemed to appreciate the change. Officer Samantha Chen, a recent addition to the force, sought Reynolds out after a shift. "I just wanted to say, I've noticed how you've been handling calls lately," she said. "It means a lot, especially to some of us who don't always feel like we fit in here." Her words gave Reynolds pause. He hadn't considered how his actions might be perceived by his fellow officers, especially those from minority backgrounds. As the weeks turned into months, Reynolds found himself increasingly involved in Captain Harris's community outreach initiatives. He attended neighborhood meetings, participated in youth mentoring programs, and even started learning Spanish to better communicate with Brooksville's growing Latino population. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but also deeply rewarding. Slowly but surely, Reynolds began to see the community he served in a new light. The people he had once viewed with suspicion or indifference became individuals with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. But as Reynolds changed, he also began to face growing tension within the department. Some officers, led by Mike Donnelly, saw his new approach as a betrayal of traditional policing values. They accused him of being soft on crime and pandering to political correctness. Reynolds knew he was at a crossroads. He could either retreat to his old ways and regain the approval of his peers, or he could continue down this new path, facing the challenges and criticisms that came with it. As he stood at this junction, Reynolds couldn't help but think back to that night when Captain Harris had pulled him over. He realized now that it hadn't just been a routine traffic stop, it had been the beginning of a journey that was reshaping not just his career, but his entire worldview. With a deep breath, Reynolds made his choice. He would continue forward, no matter the cost. Because for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving and protecting all of Brooksville's citizens, not just some of them. Little did he know, his decision would set in motion a series of events that would transform not just his own life, but the entire fabric of Brooksville itself. Captain Harris launched a new community outreach initiative, and to everyone's surprise, he asked Reynolds to lead it. The project involved regular meetings with community leaders, youth groups, and local businesses to build trust and address concerns. Reynolds' first meeting was at the community center in East Brooksville, his old neighborhood. As he walked in, he felt the weight of suspicious glances. Many remembered him as the tough, often unfair cop who had patrolled these streets for years. The community center was a far cry from the polished briefing rooms at the precinct. The walls were adorned with children's artwork and flyers for local events. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and Reynolds could feel the tension in the room as he took his seat. Standing at the podium, Reynolds took a deep breath. "I know many of you are wondering why I'm here," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "The truth is, I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do better. I haven't always been the officer this community deserves, but I'm committed to changing that." The room was silent for a moment. Then an elderly woman stood up. Mrs. Johnson. Reynolds remembered her name suddenly. She had lived on his street when he was a boy. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I remember when you were just a boy running around these streets. It's good to see you're still capable of growth." Her words broke the tension, and soon the room was filled with voices. People shared their concerns about over-policing, about feeling targeted, about the lack of opportunities for young people in the neighborhood. Reynolds listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. He took notes, asked questions, and by the end of the meeting, he had pages filled with ideas and action items. As the weeks passed, Reynolds threw himself into the community project. He organized neighborhood clean-up days, started a youth mentoring program, and worked with local businesses to create job opportunities for at-risk youth. One of his most successful initiatives was a series of Coffee with a Cop events where residents could meet officers in a casual setting and discuss their concerns. At first, these events were sparsely attended, with more officers than community members present. But gradually, as word spread about Reynolds' genuine efforts to listen and make changes, more people began to show up. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however. Reynolds faced resistance not just from the community, but from within the police department as well. Many of his fellow officers saw his efforts as a waste of time at best and a betrayal at worst. Mike Donnelly, in particular, was vocal in his opposition. "We're cops, Tom, not social workers," he said one day after a particularly heated debate at the station. "Our job is to enforce the law, not hold hands and sing Kumbaya." Reynolds felt the sting of his old friend's words, but he stood his ground. "Our job is to serve and protect, Mike. And sometimes that means building bridges instead of walls." As the months passed, small changes began to take root in Brooksville. Crime rates in East Brooksville, once one of the town's most troubled areas, began to drop. Community tip-offs led to several successful drug busts. Young people who had once viewed the police with fear and hostility were now considering careers in law enforcement. Reynolds found himself working longer hours than ever before, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of true purpose in his work. He was making a difference, not just in enforcing the law, but in building a safer, more just community for everyone. One evening, as Reynolds was leaving the community center after a late meeting, he ran into Jamal, a young man he had arrested several times in the past for minor drug offenses. "Officer Reynolds," Jamal called out, jogging to catch up with him. "I wanted to thank you." Reynolds was taken aback. "Thank me? For what?" Jamal smiled. "For giving us a chance. For listening. I've been clean for 6 months now, and I'm starting community college next semester. Never thought I'd be saying this, but you're all right for a cop." Reynolds felt a lump in his throat. This, he realized, was why he had become a police officer in the first place, to make a positive difference in people's lives. As he drove home that night, Reynolds reflected on how much had changed in just a few short months. He was a different man from the one who had pulled over Captain Harris that fateful night. But he knew the journey was far from over. 6 months into Reynolds' journey of change, a high-stakes situation put his newfound perspective to the test. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when the call came in a robbery reported at Goldstein's, a high-end jewelry store downtown. Reynolds and Mike were the first to respond. As they sped towards the scene, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Suspects described as 4 young black males, last seen heading east on Main Street. Reynolds felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but also a new sense of caution. He'd learned enough in the past months to know that such descriptions could be problematic. As they turned onto Main Street, they spotted a group of 4 young black men walking quickly down a side alley. Mike reached for his weapon, but Reynolds held up a hand. "Wait," he said. "Let's approach this carefully." Mike shot him an incredulous look. "Carefully? Tom, they match the description. We need to act fast." Reynolds shook his head. "We need to be sure. Let's talk to them first." Reluctantly, Mike agreed. They parked the car and approached the young men, who froze at the sight of the officers. Reynolds called out, keeping his voice calm and his hands visible. "Excuse me, gentlemen. We're responding to an incident nearby and wondering if you might have seen anything suspicious." The young men exchanged nervous glances. One of them, wearing a red baseball cap, spoke up. "No, sir. We haven't seen anything. We're just heading to the library for a study group." Reynolds nodded, noticing the backpacks they were carrying. "Mind if we ask where you're coming from?" "The coffee shop on 3 Ard," another young man answered. "We grabbed some drinks before hitting the books." Reynolds could feel Mike's impatience radiating beside him, but he pressed on. "Would you mind showing us some ID? It would really help us out." The young men complied, albeit with visible reluctance. A quick check confirmed their story. They were indeed college students, and their IDs showed addresses near the local university. As they sorted out the misunderstanding, Mike pulled Reynolds aside. "We could have missed the real perps because of your new soft approach," he hissed. Reynolds shook his head. "No, Mike. We could have escalated a situation unnecessarily and possibly hurt innocent people. That's not what we're here for." They let the young men go with an apology for the inconvenience. As they walked back to their patrol car, the dispatcher's voice came over the radio again. "Attention, all units. Suspects in the Goldstein robbery have been apprehended on the west side of town. 4 white males in their 30s. Mike had the grace to look sheepish. "Okay, maybe you were right this time," he grudgingly admitted. Reynolds nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. This incident had highlighted just how easily things could have gone wrong. How many times in the past had he acted on assumptions without taking the time to verify? Later that week, Reynolds found himself in Captain Harris's office, recounting the incident. Harris listened intently, nodding as Reynolds described his approach. When Reynolds finished, Harris leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You did well, Reynolds," he said. "You used judgment and restraint in a high-pressure situation. That's exactly the kind of policing we need more of." Reynolds felt a surge of pride at the captain's words, but also a nagging sense of guilt. "But sir, if I'm honest, a few months ago, I might have handled it very differently." Harris nodded, his expression serious. "That's why this work is so important, Reynolds. We're not just changing procedures, we're changing mindsets. And that's the hardest part." As Reynolds left the captain's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more tests of his new approach. But he was ready to face them. What he didn't realize was that the biggest test of all was yet to come, one that would shake the foundations of the Brooksville Police Department and force everyone, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned veteran, to confront their own biases and assumptions. It was a crisp autumn evening when the call came in. 10:10 in progress, corner of Elm and 5th. Shots fired. All available units respond. Reynolds and Mike were just finishing up their shift, but they immediately swung into action. As they sped towards the scene, Reynolds' mind raced through possible scenarios. A 10-10 was an officer in danger, the most serious call they could receive. They arrived to find chaos. An officer was down, clutching his shoulder. Another was grappling with a suspect on the ground. And a third figure was running down the street, something glinting in his hand. Without thinking, Reynolds took off after the fleeing suspect. He could hear Mike behind him, shouting into his radio for backup. The suspect darted down an alley, Reynolds in hot pursuit. As they emerged onto a dimly lit street, the suspect suddenly turned, raising his arm. Reynolds saw the glint of metal and reacted instinctively. 2 shots rang out in quick succession. The suspect crumpled to the ground. As Reynolds approached cautiously, his heart pounding, he saw the object fall from the man's hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a cell phone. The next few hours passed in a blur. More officers arrived, then paramedics, then investigators. Reynolds gave his statement, his mind still reeling from what had happened. The suspect, he learned the man's name was Darnell Thompson, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. It wasn't until much later, as Reynolds sat in the quiet of his apartment, that the full weight of what had happened hit him. He had shot an unarmed man. Everything he had been working towards, all the progress he thought he'd made, had it all been an illusion? The next morning, Reynolds woke to find his phone buzzing with messages and missed calls. The shooting was all over the news. Protesters were gathering outside the police station, demanding justice for Darnell Thompson. As Reynolds drove to the station, he passed by groups of people holding signs. "Black Lives Matter," read one. "No justice, no peace," proclaimed another. He felt a deep sense of shame and regret wash over him. At the station, Captain Harris called him into his office. The captain's face was grave. "Reynolds, I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation," he said. "I need your badge and your gun." Reynolds nodded numbly, handing over his equipment. As he turned to leave, Harris spoke again. "Tom," he said, his voice softer now, "I know you've been working hard to change. But change isn't just about intentions. It's about actions, especially in the heat of the moment." Reynolds left the station feeling lost. Everything he had worked for seemed to be crumbling around him. He had tried so hard to be better, to do better. And yet, when it really mattered, he had fallen back on old instincts and assumptions. As the days passed, the controversy grew. The media dug into Reynolds' past, uncovering complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. His recent efforts at community outreach were overshadowed by his long history of aggressive policing. The community he had been working so hard to connect with now viewed him with anger and distrust. Even some of his fellow officers who had been skeptical of his changes now distanced themselves from him. Reynolds found himself at the lowest point of his life. He questioned everything: his career, his beliefs, even his own character. Had he ever really changed at all? Or had he just been fooling himself? It was in this dark moment that Reynolds received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman from his old neighborhood, showed up at his door one evening. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice firm but kind, "I heard what happened. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to remind you of something." Reynolds invited her in, curious despite his dejection. Mrs. Johnson settled into a chair and fixed Reynolds with a steady gaze. "Do you remember what I said to you at that first community meeting? About being capable of growth?" Reynolds nodded. "Well," she continued, "growth isn't a straight line. It's full of setbacks and mistakes. What matters is what you do next. Are you going to give up, or are you going to learn from this and keep trying to be better?" Her words struck a chord in Reynolds. He realized that this incident, as terrible as it was, didn't negate all the progress he had made. It was a harsh reminder of how deep-seated biases could be, and how much work he still had to do. As Mrs. Johnson left, Reynolds felt a glimmer of resolve return. He knew he had a long road ahead. There would be investigations, possibly a trial, and a lot of soul-searching. But he was determined to face it head-on. He couldn't change what had happened that night, but he could choose how he responded to it. And in that choice lay the possibility of real, lasting change, not just for himself, but for the entire Brooksville Police Department. Little did Reynolds know, his journey was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge him in ways he never could have imagined. The weeks following the shooting were the most difficult of Reynolds' life. The investigation into the incident was thorough and unsparing. Every aspect of his career was scrutinized, every decision questioned. Reynolds cooperated fully, answering questions honestly, even when the answers painted him in an unflattering light. He spoke about his past biases, his efforts to change, and the split-second decision that had led to the shooting. As the investigation progressed, Reynolds found an unlikely ally in Jamal, the young man he had once arrested multiple times. Jamal had become a respected voice in the community, and he spoke out about Reynolds' recent efforts at reform. "Officer Reynolds made mistakes in the past, no doubt," Jamal told a local news reporter. "But he's been trying to do better. We can't ignore that. This incident is a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity for real change." Jamal's words sparked a broader conversation in Brooksville. While many still called for Reynolds to be fired and charged, others began to discuss the systemic issues that led to such incidents. Meanwhile, Darnell Thompson, the man Reynolds had shot, was recovering in the hospital. Against all odds, he had survived. As soon as he was allowed, Reynolds went to visit him. The meeting was tense and emotional. Thompson was understandably angry, his trust in the police shattered. But as Reynolds spoke, explaining his actions and expressing his deep remorse, Thompson's anger began to give way to a cautious understanding. "I can't forgive you, not yet," Thompson said. "But I hear you, and I think maybe some good can come out of this." That conversation was a turning point. Thompson, once he recovered, became an advocate for police reform. He and Reynolds, in an unexpected twist, began to work together to push for changes in police training and procedures. As the investigation concluded, Reynolds faced the consequences of his actions. He was suspended without pay for 6 months and required to undergo extensive retraining before he could return to active duty. But he was also given the opportunity to be part of reshaping the department's approach to community policing. Captain Harris, who had been under pressure to fire Reynolds, stood firm. "Officer Reynolds made a grave mistake," he told the police commission. "But he's also shown a genuine commitment to change. I believe he can be more valuable to this department and this community as an example of transformation than as a cautionary tale." The decision was controversial, but it opened the door for a broader reform effort within the Brooksville Police Department. New training programs were implemented, focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. The community outreach initiatives that Reynolds had started were expanded and given more resources. For Reynolds, the journey was far from over. He knew he had a long way to go to rebuild trust, both within the department and in the community. But he was committed to the path, no matter how difficult. As he prepared to return to duty, Reynolds reflected on how far he had come since that night when Captain Harris had pulled him over. He was a different man now, humbled by his mistakes, but determined to learn from them. What he didn't know was that his biggest challenge and his greatest opportunity for redemption was yet to come. Brooksville was about to face a crisis that would test everything Reynolds had learned and force him to confront the deep-rooted issues in the town he had sworn to protect and serve. Brooksville had always been a town divided, with clear lines separating the affluent west side from the struggling east side. But as summer approached, those divisions threatened to tear the town apart. It started with budget cuts. The city council, facing a shortfall, decided to close the community center in East Brooksville. The center had been a lifeline for many in the neighborhood, providing after-school programs, job training, and a safe space for youth. The announcement sparked outrage. Protests began small but grew quickly. Soon, hundreds were marching through the streets, demanding the decision be reversed. Reynolds, back on active duty, found himself caught in the middle. He understood the community's anger. The center had been crucial to his own outreach efforts. But he also had a duty to maintain order. As tensions rose, so did temperatures. A heat wave hit Brooksville, pushing tempers to the breaking point. Reports of vandalism and looting began to come in. The mayor, under pressure from West Side residents, called for a stronger police response. Captain Harris resisted, arguing for a more measured approach. But when a fire broke out at City Hall, he was overruled. The order came down: disperse the protesters by force if necessary. Reynolds felt sick as he donned his riot gear. This was everything he had been working against: armed officers facing off against angry citizens. But he also saw an opportunity. Maybe, just maybe, he could prevent this from escalating into a full-blown riot. As the police line advanced towards the protesters, Reynolds broke rank. Removing his helmet, he walked into the space between the two groups. "Please," he called out, his voice carrying over the angry shouts. "Let's talk about this. There has to be a better way." For a moment, it seemed like no one was listening. Then, from the crowd of protesters, a familiar face emerged. It was Jamal. "Officer Reynolds is right," Jamal shouted. "Violence isn't the answer, but neither is closing our community center. We need to find a solution together." Slowly, cautiously, leaders from both sides came forward. Reynolds facilitated a tense but productive discussion right there on the street. By the end of the night, a tentative agreement had been reached. The community center would remain open, funded in part by donations from West Side businesses. The crisis had been averted, but it had exposed the deep rifts in Brooksville's social fabric. Reynolds realized that true change would require more than just reforming the police department. It would mean addressing the systemic inequalities that had divided the town for generations. In the weeks that followed, Reynolds threw himself into this broader mission. He worked with community leaders to develop programs that would bridge the gap between East and West Brooksville. He lobbied the city council for more equitable funding. And he continued to push for reforms within the police department, arguing that they needed to be guardians of the community, not just enforcers of the law. It wasn't easy. Reynolds faced resistance from all sides, from fellow officers who thought he was overstepping his role, from West Side residents who feared change, and from East Side residents who still struggled to trust the police. But slowly, persistently, progress was made. New community police partnerships were formed. Joint East-West initiatives were launched. The police department revised its training and recruitment practices to better reflect and serve the diverse Brooksville community. As autumn arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and calmer tempers, Reynolds could see the impact of these efforts. Crime rates were down. Community engagement was up. And while Brooksville was still far from perfect, there was a sense of hope in the air, a feeling that real change was possible. One evening, as Reynolds walked his beat in East Brooksville, he passed by the community center. The sound of laughter and music drifted out into the street. Inside, he could see people of all ages and backgrounds coming together in a space that had nearly been lost. As he watched, Reynolds felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why he had become a police officer in the first place, not just to enforce laws, but to help build a stronger, safer, more just community for everyone. He knew the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more moments of doubt. But as he continued his patrol, Officer Tom Reynolds walked with a new sense of purpose. He had found his true calling, not just as a cop, but as a bridge builder, a peacemaker, a force for positive change in the community he served. And in that moment, he silently thanked Captain Harris for that fateful traffic stop that had set him on this path. It had been a long and difficult journey, but one that had led him to exactly where he needed to be. As the months passed, the changes in Brooksville began to attract attention beyond the town's borders. Local news outlets ran features on the town's innovative approach to community policing. Criminology researchers from nearby universities came to study the Brooksville model. Reynolds found himself increasingly in the spotlight. He was invited to speak at conferences, sharing Brooksville's story and the lessons he had learned. At first, he was reluctant, still uncomfortable with the attention and aware of how much work still needed to be done. But Captain Harris encouraged him. "Your story can inspire others, Reynolds," Harris said. "It's not about boasting. It's about showing what's possible when we're willing to confront our biases and work for real change." So Reynolds began to speak out. He talked about his own journey, not shying away from his past mistakes or the shooting incident. He emphasized the ongoing nature of the work, the constant need for self-reflection and community engagement. One day, after giving a talk at a regional police conference, Reynolds was approached by a young officer from a neighboring town. "Sir," the officer said, her voice hesitant, I've been struggling with some of the things I've seen in my department. The way we treat certain communities. I want to make changes, but I don't know how. How did you find the courage to start?" Reynolds looked at the young officer, seeing in her the same uncertainty and desire for change that he had felt not so long ago. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "The hardest part is admitting that there's a problem," he said. "You've already done that. The next step is to start small. Look for allies, both in your department and in the community. And remember, it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them and keep trying to do better." As word of Brooksville's success spread, other police departments began to reach out. They wanted to know more about the training programs, the community initiatives, the policy changes. Reynolds and Captain Harris found themselves consulting with chiefs and mayors from across the state, helping them implement similar reforms. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Some officers, both in Brooksville and in other departments, felt that the new approach was too soft, that it undermined traditional policing. They argued that crime would rise if officers were too constrained. Reynolds faced this criticism head-on. He pointed to Brooksville's falling crime rates, the increased cooperation from the community, the higher solve rates for serious crimes. "We're not being soft," he would argue. "We're being smart. We're building trust, and that makes us more effective at our jobs." Back in Brooksville, the ripple effects of the changes were being felt throughout the community. The improved relationship with the police had led to increased reporting of crimes, allowing officers to address issues before they escalated. Community tip-offs had led to the bust of a major drug operation that had been plaguing the East Side for years. But perhaps the most significant change was in the town's youth. Kids who had once viewed the police with fear and hostility were now considering careers in law enforcement. The police department's cadet program, which Reynolds had helped to revamp, was receiving record numbers of applications, particularly from minority students. One evening, as Reynolds was leaving the station after a long shift, he ran into Jamal. The young man was dressed in a sharp suit, looking a far cry from the troubled teen Reynolds had first encountered years ago. "Officer Reynolds," Jamal called out, a smile on his face. "I've got some news. I've been accepted to law school. I'm going to be a civil rights attorney." Reynolds felt a surge of pride. "That's fantastic, Jamal." "You're going to do great things," Jamal nodded, his expression turning serious. "I wanted to thank you. You showed me that change is possible, that we can work to make the system better. I want to be part of that change." As Jamal walked away, Reynolds felt a lump in his throat. This, he realized, was the true measure of their success. Not just in lower crime rates or better community relations, but in inspiring the next generation to carry the work forward. That night, as Reynolds lay in bed reflecting on the day, he thought about how far Brooksville had come. The town was far from perfect. There were still challenges to face, biases to overcome, trust to be built. But there was progress, real and tangible. He thought back to that night when Captain Harris had pulled him over, the night that had set him on this path. Reynolds sent a silent thank you to the captain, grateful for the wake-up call that had changed not just his life, but the lives of so many others. As he drifted off to sleep, Reynolds felt a sense of peace. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But he was ready to face them, committed to the ongoing journey of change. Little did he know, the biggest test of Brooksville's transformation was yet to come, a crisis that would shake the town to its core and force everyone, from the police to the community, to put their newfound unity to the ultimate test. The call came in on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A hostage situation at Brooksville High School. An armed man had barricaded himself in the library with a group of students and teachers. As Reynolds sped towards the scene, his mind raced. This was the kind of high-stakes situation that could undo all the progress they had made if handled poorly. He knew that every eye in Brooksville would be on the police department, watching to see how they responded. When he arrived, the scene was chaos. Panicked parents were gathering, held back by a hastily established police line. SWAT teams were positioning themselves around the building. Media vans were already setting up, their satellite dishes reaching towards the sky. Captain Harris was already there, his face grim as he briefed Reynolds. "The suspect is Michael Donnelly," he said, his voice low. Reynolds felt his blood run cold. Mike Donnelly, his former partner, the officer who had resisted the changes in the department most vocally. The man who had been forced to resign 6 months ago after a series of complaints about his aggressive tactics. "He's demanding to speak to you, Reynolds," Harris continued. "Says he'll only negotiate with you." Reynolds nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "I'm going in," he said. Harris looked at him sharply. Are you sure that's wise? Given your history, that history is exactly why it has to be me, Reynolds replied. I know Mike. I might be able to talk him down. After a tense discussion with the SWAT commander, Reynolds was given the green light. Wearing a bulletproof vest and with a small microphone hidden in his collar, he approached the school building. Mike, he called out as he entered the library. It's Tom. I'm here to talk. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mike's voice, strained and angry, called out from behind a row of bookshelves. That's far enough, Tom. Any closer and I start shooting. Reynolds held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. Okay, Mike. I'm not here to trick you. I just want to talk. Can you tell me what's going on? Over the next hour, Reynolds listened as Mike poured out his grievances. He felt betrayed by the department, angry at the changes that had weakened policing. He railed against a society that he felt no longer respected law and order. As Mike talked, Reynolds could hear the fear and pain beneath the anger. He remembered the good cop Mike had once been, before bitterness and prejudice had twisted his perspective. I hear you, Mike, Reynolds said softly. I know you're hurting, but this isn't the way to handle it. These kids, these teachers, they're innocent. They don't deserve to be caught up in this. Don't talk to me about innocent. Mike shouted. Where was all this concern for innocence when they were dragging my name through the mud? When they were calling me a racist and a bully? Reynolds took a deep breath. Mike, do you remember why we became cops? It wasn't for the glory or the power. It was to protect people, to serve our community. That hasn't changed. The way we do it has evolved, but the core mission is the same. He could see Mike wavering, the gun in his hand trembling slightly. Reynolds pressed on, his voice calm and steady. I know you feel like you've lost everything, but it's not too late. You can still be the good man I know you are. Let these people go, and I promise you, I'll make sure you're treated fairly. For a long moment, the library was silent. Reynolds could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Then slowly, Mike lowered his gun. Okay, Tom, he said, his voice breaking. Double quotes okay, double quotes. As the hostages were let out and Mike was taken into custody, Reynolds felt a wave of relief wash over him. But he knew that the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, Brooksville came together in a way it never had before. The community rallied around the students and teachers, offering support and counseling. There were vigils and town hall meetings where people shared their fears and hopes for the future. The police department faced tough questions about how one of their own had fallen so far. But instead of becoming defensive, they used it as an opportunity for further reform. New mental health support systems were put in place for officers. The vetting process for new recruits was overhauled. Reynolds found himself at the center of it all, working tirelessly to bridge gaps and facilitate difficult conversations. He spoke openly about his own journey, about the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. As the weeks passed and Brooksville began to heal, Reynolds realized that this crisis, as terrible as it had been, had also been an opportunity. It had tested the strength of the changes they had made and shown that real progress had indeed taken root. One evening, as Reynolds walked through the park near the high school, he saw a group of teenagers playing basketball. Among them were kids from both the east and west sides of town, laughing and joking together. As he watched, one of the teens spotted him and waved. Hey, Officer Reynolds. Want to join us? Reynolds smiled and shook his head. Thanks, but I think I'd just slow you down. You kids have fun. As he continued his walk, Reynolds felt a sense of hope stronger than he had ever experienced. Brooksville had faced its ultimate test and had come through stronger and more united. There would always be challenges ahead, always more work to be done. But Reynolds knew now, without a doubt, that change was possible, that a community could heal, grow, and become something better than it had been before. And he, Tom Reynolds, once the embodiment of old school, biased policing, had played a part in making the change happen. It was a legacy he could be proud of, a journey that had transformed not just him, but an entire town. As the sun set over Brooksville, casting a warm glow over the streets he had patrolled for so many years, Reynolds felt a deep sense of peace. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And in that moment, he silently thanked Captain Harris once again for that fateful traffic stop that had set him on this path. It had been a long and difficult journey, but one that had led him and Brooksville to a brighter future.